Hello and welcome to the LLG Grapevine podcast, and a Happy New Year to you all. This week you're listening to Helen McGrath, LLG Head of Public Affairs, and Dennis Hall, LLG Bulletin Editor.
Hi everyone, and a Happy New Year from me too.
And it's a very special New Year edition, because we are returning to our popular joint format for the podcast, where both Dennis and myself will be selecting topics of interest to our members, mainly from the bulletin, but also from our regular tweets and other trending news.
And as this is our first of the year, we will look at some of the trends and changes that are likely to emerge during 2022. So here goes. Let's take a look at employment law. What changes can we expect this year? Well, over the last 2 years, the COVID pandemic has meant that many of the expected employment law changes have either been delayed or postponed. This year may see legislative developments finally start to progress. Here are just a few of the key points that we can expect to hear about. Point 1, mandatory vaccination. Now, indications suggest that statutory provisions will be introduced early in the spring to extend mandatory vaccination to across the whole social care sector. Omicron has made this far more likely sooner rather than later. Point 2, workplace sexual harassment. Last July, the government published its response to the consultation on workplace sexual harassment. It confirmed that the government will introduce a duty on employers to prevent sexual harassment and new protections from third-party harassment when parliamentary time allows. Draft legislation to implement the new duty has not yet been published, but is anticipated during 2022. Point 3, the new right to carers' leave. Last September, the government published its response to the 2020 consultation on carers' leave, confirming that it plans to legislate for an entitlement to carers' leave for employees as a day one employment right. This new right is likely to be included in the forthcoming employment bill expected this year. Point 4, the right to request flexible working. A new consultation has already been published on proposals to extend the existing right to request flexible working from day one of employment. And the new provisions are likely to be included too in the anticipated employment bill. And finally, point 5, that employment bill. In December 2019, a new employment bill was announced in the Queen's speech, but it is yet to be published and was notably absent from the May 2021 Queen's speech. Now, the government has since indicated, however, that the bill will be forthcoming when parliamentary time allows during 2022.
It seems that parliamentary time is affecting progress of more than one area, but let's look at some of the areas that are progressing. We have the Abuse of Public-Facing Workers Offences Bill, which is currently at the second reading stage in the House of Commons. This is a private member's bill to make provision for and in connection with offences relating to verbal and physical abuse of public-facing workers in the course of their employment. I'm sure many of us have at some point, unfortunately, experienced that. There's the Dissolution and Calling of Parliament Bill at the committee stage in the House of Lords. If you cast your mind back to August 2019, we had the proroguing of Parliament, which a month later the Supreme Court found to be unlawful. This bill repeals the Fixed Term Parliaments Act, but revives the prerogative powers to dissolve Parliament and call a new one, and crucially, specifically prevents a court or tribunal from questioning those powers. The Elections Bill is at the report stage in the House of Commons. Think voter ID, but there's actually much more to it than that. It includes provision about overseas electors, EU citizen voting and candidacy rights, and the designation of a strategy and policy statement for the Electoral Commission. Other notable bills include the Health and Care Bill at committee stage in the House of Lords, the Judicial Review and Courts Bill at the report stage of the House of Commons, the Registers of Births and Deaths Bill, which had its first reading in December, the Local Government Disqualification Bill at report stage in the House of Commons, and the Prime Minister Temporary Replacement Bill in its second reading. I say no more about that. Finally, it's worth remembering we have the human rights reform currently in consultation, and things have gone very quiet on the planning reform front. Dennis, what are the expectations during 2020 as to how councils might deal with the changes and challenges that face them.
Well, many commentators and think tanks have addressed the question of how local authorities need to change to tackle the big issues that face them during 2022. The consensus suggests that this is the year that councils need to step up to lead their local communities. PwC make a number of interesting points in their recent paper. They say, is the time now for councils to capitalise on their role as leaders of place and of their local communities. PwC say that local government already recognises the need for this strategic step change. But national government needs to be prepared to create the environment that allows this to happen. PwC argue that a window of opportunity now exists to seize and build on the positive collective response to the pandemic from the local government sector, its partners and others to work in a different way. The current situation presents many challenges, but also offers local government a golden opportunity to redefine its purpose and maintain its relevance in a rapidly changing context. They need to widen their role beyond the delivery of services, to lead, shape and influence public policy to meet the challenges of the future. We'll hear far more on this theme in the coming months.
Something else you might be hearing more about this year is levelling up. There's an interesting article published in the Local Government Information Unit by Gemma Tatlow, in which she argues that the government is running out of time to spell out its levelling up strategy, and in doing so, is limiting its scope to tackle the UK's regional inequalities. Having widely expected that the white paper would come out in December, commentators are now suggesting we might get to see it in January, but to what end? Gemma advises the UK's long-standing inequalities in economic performance and other measures of well-being will not be resolved in a single parliament, let alone in half a parliament. However, the government could start to make meaningful progress before the next election if ministers decide what their priorities are, communicate those clearly to the rest of government and to the private sector, and start setting out the measures they will roll out in pursuit of these objectives. But the later the government leaves it to provide more detail, the less likely it is that the government departments, the devolved administrations, and local authorities will be able to marshal their resources to make a visible difference before the next election. Last month, Sky News reported that while more than half of the first round money was allocated to 25% of local authorities most in need of levelling up, according to the Institute for Fiscal Studies Left Behind Index, only 2 in 5 top priority areas won funding. Now, Dennis, I mentioned earlier the current progress of the Judicial Review and Courts Bill, but I understand all might not be as it seems. You've been covering the story concerning the government's planned changes to Judicial Review. Has all of this been put to rest, or is there more to come?
The government is still not content that ministerial decisions can be subject to judicial review. Ministers, especially the Prime Minister, want the upper hand. It was reported before Christmas that Downing Street is planning curbs on judicial review going above and beyond those in legislation currently going through Parliament. Quoting Whitehall sources, The Times reported that Boris Johnson is unhappy with the Judicial Review and Courts Bill and has ordered the Justice Secretary to toughen plans to restrict judges' powers to rule on the legality of ministerial decisions. One option drawn up by Dominic Raab and Suella Braverman is for MPs to pass an annual interpretation bill to strike out findings from JRs with which the government does not agree. Law Society President I. Stephanie Boyce said, British democracy is founded on the principles that legislation is passed by Parliament and that an independent judiciary interprets the rules. This makes sure government has to answer for its actions just like the rest of us. If the government wants to avoid losing court cases, it should ensure that decisions are made within the law of the land.
A sentiment which is hard to argue with. Now, whilst we're waiting for the government's response to the call for evidence on remote meeting provision for local government, Baroness Bennett was helpfully asking a question in Parliament further to the spread of Omicron as to whether local government bodies can hold meetings remotely if they choose. Lord Greenhow responded that this would require a change to primary legislation, which was dependent upon parliamentary time being available. This is a repeated line, which we are now all too familiar with. We are no clearer to understanding why parliamentary time cannot be identified. Having written in December to Kemi Badenoch, Minister of State, urging immediate provision given the rising cases, local authorities have been left with difficult decisions over safety in meetings without quorum. Remote meetings are much more than just handling the initial crisis. They could improve both democratic representation and participation. But right now, it is the crisis which is very much driving the urgent need to do something. Last week, LLG, along with ADSO, wrote to the Shadow Secretary at the DLUHC, Lisa Nandy, about this issue. We have also launched a petition on change.org to raise awareness and would very much appreciate your support by signing it and encouraging others to do so. You can find the link on the news page of our website or simply search LLG ADSO in the search box of change.org itself. And with that, you can get much more on this and all the items mentioned in this week's podcast by going to Bulletin 1, available Friday the 7th on the LLG website. So it's goodbye from me.
And from me too.
Have a good week, and thank you for listening.